The Walstad method has become incredibly popular for people who want a low-tech, natural, low-maintenance aquarium. But with its growing popularity, there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation about what this method actually entails. A lot of people new to this side of the hobby often think that any tank with dirt and plants in it is a Walstad Method aquarium, but that's not accurate. Unfortunately, mixing this method up with any other cap dirt methods or adding your own tweaks may make this more difficult than it has to be and potentially cause long-term issues with your tank. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the core principles that actually define a Walstad Method aquarium based on both Dianna Walstad's book as well as my own experiences of running multiple tanks using this method. One of the most important things to get right when setting up a Walstad Method aquarium is the substrate, because it uses a soil nutrient layer which is then capped with fine gravel. Dianna Walstad states in her book that she uses potting soil or ordinary garden soil, and I personally interpreted the ordinary garden soil to mean topsoil, which is what I use in my tanks. Now, a lot of people think that potting soil and topsoil are similar, but there are some important differences. Potting soil typically has a higher nutrient content which can feed your plants for longer, but if you make mistakes at other stages of the setup, this may also result in algae blooms in your tank as the nutrients leak into the tank's water. Not only does topsoil contain less nutrients than potting soil, but in my area it's also far cheaper than a lot of the popular potting soil options on the market too. Another crucial point is that you should use a soil that has no added chemicals or slow release fertilizers within it, and this is an area I do see people go wrong. If you start to add enhancers or fertilizers to your soil mix, you are drifting away from a strict Walstad Method aquarium and moving more towards a father fish style setup. I have made a separate video comparing the Walstad method and the father fish method that I link to in the description if you want more detail. Here in the United Kingdom, we also have the John and East soil mixes too, which are sometimes recommended for people looking for soil recommendations for Walstad method tanks. However, these do contain additives, and while they do seem to work perfectly well in a lot of cases, I have seen some forum and social media posts where people have used them and had problems. Personally, I use the regular Westland topsoil, which is very cheap and easy to find here in the UK, but unfortunately it can be difficult to find in other countries, but I'm sure there'll be topsoil or potting soil alternatives available in your area. As I mentioned earlier, potting soil does have a higher nutrient content, but in my personal experience, topsoil contains plenty of nutrients for this style of aquarium too. So to summarise this section, Walstad Method tanks use potting soil or topsoil as their nutrient layer without any enhancers at all. Next up is the capping layer, which is another area where people often run into problems. Dianna Walstad recommends a 1-inch deep capping layer on top of your soil which has a grain size of between 2 and 3 millimeters. But she does also mention that sand can be used successfully, but recommends that you keep it to around 3/4 of an inch deep. This is because the Walstad method relies on maintaining aerobic conditions in the substrate, meaning that we want as much oxygenated water to be able to penetrate the cap and reach the soil to keep our plant roots as healthy as possible. Two common mistakes that I see is people using a sand cap that is too thick, which can restrict oxygen flow into the substrate, or using a gravel that's too coarse, which can allow water-soluble nutrients to escape the soil and get into the water column, resulting in algae blooms. So to sum up this section, while other grain sizes can work, the gold standard for a Walstad Method aquarium is a 1-inch layer of gravel which has a grain size of 2 to 3 millimeters, and I do personally think this strikes the perfect spot from all of my testing last year. Next up, I want to talk about filters, which is probably the most controversial topic when it comes to Walstad Method aquariums. I do have a dedicated video on this topic which I link to in the description if you want more details. In short, both filtered and filterless Walstad Method tanks are completely valid approaches, and Dianna Walstad confirms this in her latest edition of her book. I've personally experimented with both, and I definitely think it's a lot easier to get one of these tanks running successfully if you do use a small filter, as it offers several advantages for your very first Walstad Method tank. She primarily uses the filters in her filtered setups for water flow to move heat and oxygen and nutrients around the tank so they come into contact with the plants. On top of that, only if necessary, she adds mechanical filtration such as filter floss to these filters to help get any debris out of the tank's water column, which can be a problem with some setups. She doesn't rely on her filters for biological filtration, as the plants in the tank keep ammonia and nitrite levels under control. It's also worth noting that she prefers internal or canister filters to create minimal surface disturbance, helping to preserve the naturally generated CO2 in the water for the plants to use. At the time of recording this video, I've recently removed the filters from my previously filtered Walstad Method tanks, and I haven't noticed any spikes in ammonia or nitrogen levels, and all of my new Walstad Method tanks have been set up to be filterless from the very beginning. If you do choose to go filterless with your very first Walstad Method aquarium, I do highly recommend you actually read Dianna Walstad's book, and I link to it in the description, and watching the rest of this video should help keep you in the right direction. So to summarise this section, both filtered and filterless setups follow the Walstad method, but many people, including myself, are drawn to the filterless version of this method where the plants provide the natural filtration the tank needs. Next up are air stones, and like many other things in a Walstad Method aquarium, they are generally not part of the setup unless something goes wrong. Dianna Walstad does note that she doesn't typically use air stones in her tanks, but she will recommend them if you notice your fish are actually gasping for air at the surface. That's because gasping for air is usually a sign of low dissolved oxygen levels in the tank, which are often caused by mistakes elsewhere in the setup. Fortunately, healthy plant growth naturally boosts oxygen levels in your aquarium in multiple ways, so air stones are generally not required. Plants produce oxygen via photosynthesis to naturally increase the dissolved oxygen levels in the aquarium, but they can also drastically reduce the biological and chemical oxygen demands in the tank to leave more dissolved oxygen for your fish. So in a well-planted, correctly set up Walstad Method tank, fish gasping at the surface really shouldn't be an issue. Now, water temperature does play a role in how much dissolved oxygen and dissolved CO2 the water can actually hold, but in warmer water, photosynthesis, at least in my experience, does seem to occur at a faster rate, helping to balance this out. It's also worth noting that air stones can cause surface agitation in your tank, which can release CO2 into the atmosphere, which your plants would otherwise have put to use. So to sum up this section, air stones aren't typically needed in a Walstad Method aquarium, but they can still be useful in an emergency if you make a mistake and you notice your fish are gasping for air at the surface of the tank. Next up, I want to talk about actually planting your tank, as this is a crucial part of a Walstad Method aquarium and one of the areas I often see people make easily avoidable mistakes. Now, Dianna recommends planting a wide variety of different species in your first Walstad Method aquarium just to see which ones do well with your specific water parameters. This is because several factors such as pH, GH and KH can tweak how your plants will grow in your specific water, and in my home city we actually have 4 different water sources, all with very different water parameters to each other. Personally, I do like to add plenty of fast-grown stem plants such as Limnophila sessiliflora, Hygrophila polysperma, pearlweed and Rotala rotundifolia. Fast-grown stolon plants such as Vallisneria and to some extent dwarf Sagittaria can also work well, although I'm not a big fan of stolon plants because they send out runners, which does increase maintenance as they start to take over the tank. Now, these fast-grown plants aren't just for looks, they actively help to stabilise your water parameters and keep your fish safe. Fast-grown plants can absorb a surprisingly large amount of ammonium as a nutrient source, helping to reduce toxicity and making the environment in your tank far safer. On top of that, they'll also take up a lot of mineral ions as a nutrient source, which helps manage the total dissolved solids in your water and again, keeping things safe for your fish. One common mistake that I do see people make is using a lot of slow-grown plants such as Anubias, Java Fern, Bucephalandra or Bacopa caroliniana. While I do keep all of these plants myself, and I keep most of them in Walstad Method aquariums, these serve as a decorative role rather than as a primary natural filtration role. This is why I usually add a lot of moderate to fast-grown stem plants in the back of my Walstad Method aquariums so I can use other decorative plants in other areas. Another common issue I see people have is actually underplanting their aquariums. A Walstad Method tank should be heavily planted from the very beginning if possible. This is another benefit of fast-grown stem plants, as you can trim the excess plant growth from the top and replant it to get free plants in your tank to quickly fill out the required spaces. Some other popular capture methods do rely on anoxic zones to help manage the toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite buildup, so they can use a lot of slow-grown plants. But that is not the goal of a Walstad Method aquarium. We want to rely on our fast-grown plants to keep those toxins under control rather than anoxic zones. So to summarise, planting heavily, ideally from the very start, with an aim of keeping a variety of species, especially if you're new to the hobby, sticks to the Walstad Method. This not only helps you discover which aquarium plants will do well in your water source, but it also adds a lot of plant mass, pulling nutrients out of the water column from the start, giving you a high chance of success. Moving on, and we get to floating plants, which is an important part of the Walstad Method, so much so that there's an entire chapter about them in Dianna Walstad's book called The Aerial Advantage. If you choose a fast-grown floating plant such as duckweed or water lettuce, both which are well known for their ability to naturally purify water, then you are on the right track and may be able to rely on slow-grown submerged plants because your floating plants will do a lot of the work. That said, I personally prefer to use both fast-grown floating plants and stem plants and take advantage of both at the same time. While duckweed and water lettuce are arguably the best floating plants for this style of tank, other great options include salvinia, Amazon frogbit and hornwort, all of which grow quickly and help maintain safe and stable water parameters for your fish. Redroot floaters can be a stunning addition to your tank due to their vibrant colour hues, but these do tend to grow slower in my experience, and they are far less hardy than the other popular plants in the hobby. Right now, my two new Walstad Method tanks only have redroot floaters on their surface, but this is purely because salvinia was out of stock when I put their plant order in, and next month I'm hoping to get some salvinia to add to these redroot floaters. So to sum up this section, floating plants are a powerful tool to a Walstad Method aquarium, and while they're not technically essential, they can make things so much easier than a tank that doesn't have floating plants in it. Moving on, and we get to water changes, which is another topic that is often controversial with this type of aquarium. This is because a lot of people presume that a Walstad Method aquarium is a zero water change aquarium, but in reality, it's more accurate to think of it as water changes only being used in cases of emergency. But it is important to note that regular water changes are highly recommended during the first month or so of a new Walstad Method aquarium setup. This is because soil can release a surprisingly high amount of ammonia into the tank's water column, so daily, or at least nearly daily, water changes may be required to keep everything safe. Once the plants and microorganisms start to establish themselves, then the need for water changes does rapidly decrease, and this can be in as little as 2 weeks after the initial setup. This is because the two main reasons that people usually do water changes in the hobby is to reduce nitrate levels, to reduce algae growth, and to remove excess elemental ions, which will contribute to TDS, and in a regular tank get to toxic levels for your fish. But, as I mentioned earlier in the video, fast-grown plants will help to manage both of these and drastically reduce the need for water changes in these tanks. Now, Dianna Walstad does mention in the book that she may do a 25 to 50% water change in her tanks every 3 to 6 months. Personally, I have some of my Walstad Method aquariums that have gone far longer without water changes with minimal issues, and they have Neocaridina shrimp colonies in them which are constantly breeding, suggesting that everything in there is fine, and I can't find any problems with my TDS test kit or my ammonia and nitrite test kits either. So to summarise, if your tank is planted with fast-grown stem, stall-on or floating plants, water changes generally only need to be done in emergencies, as in if you have an ammonia spike due to accidental overfeeding or something like that. However, during the initial setup phase, frequent water changes can be very important in most Walstad aquariums, so they are highly recommended for the first couple of weeks. Next up is gravel cleaning, and this is an area where a lot of people get confused, especially if they are coming from the aquascaping side of the hobby or watch a lot of aquascaping influencers. Now, just to be clear, I watch a lot of aquascaping channels myself, usually just for inspiration and new plant recommendations, but I do understand why a lot of people assume you need to do regular gravel vacuuming on a Walstad tank because of what happens with an aquascape tank. But gravel vacuuming a Walstad Method aquarium can actually cause more harm than good. For one, it actually risks disturbing your base soil layer and mixing it in with your gravel cap, which can lead to the nutrients leaking into the water, resulting in cloudy water, algae blooms and high toxicity levels which are not safe for your fish. But it also removes organic matter, which is beneficial in this type of aquarium. The detritus you may see building up on your substrate serves as a valuable food source for microfauna like shrimp, snails, waterlouse and scuds. But even more crucially, it's also an extremely valuable food source for the waste-eating bacteria we have in the tank, which is in the soil that we put in there, and personally I believe this is one of the most underrated parts of capped dirt setups. These bacteria play several essential roles in the tank because they break down organic material such as leftover fish food, fish waste and decaying plant matter, and through respiration and mineralization, they produce a lot of natural CO2 for our aquarium so our plants can grow. So by leaving that detritus in place, you support a healthy bacterial colony which can help quickly break down fish waste and uneaten food and decaying plant matter, keeping your tank tidy, reducing maintenance on your part, but also increasing CO2 in the tank. So to sum this section up, I'm just going to quote Dianna Walstad directly, and that is that gravel cleaning is unnecessary and can actually be detrimental to the tank. But I do want to specify it can take a couple of months for your waste-eating bacteria colonies to build up to a level where they'll actually actively keep your tank clean, but leaving that organic matter in there gives them a food source to encourage growth and speeds the process up. Moving on, and we get to feeding the tank, which is another area where I often see people go wrong for a variety of different reasons. Some people intentionally underfeed their Walstad Method tanks, especially if they are moving over from the father fish method where light feeding is encouraged. Other people may keep fish like live bearers such as guppies, which will constantly eat food if it's available and potentially gain weight and have health issues. But in a Walstad Method aquarium, feeding plays an important dual role. Again, to quote Dianna Walstad herself, I always feed my fish well, plus add a little extra for the plants. And that's something we all really need to keep in mind with this type of aquarium. While the soil layer provides some long-lasting minerals, with some nutrients remaining viable for decades, others like carbon can be depleted in around a year. That's where the secondary fertilization comes in, which is detritus. Thankfully, feeding high-quality fish foods like the ones I linked to in the video description that I personally use doesn't just nourish your fish. The leftover food and fish waste end up getting broken down by the waste-eating bacteria I mentioned earlier in the video, which not only mineralise the nutrients making them available for your plants, but release CO2 through respiration. This helps the plants easily absorb key minerals that may be deficient directly through the water column via their stems and leaves. If you are keeping fish that tend to overeat, such as guppies, you can add shrimp or snails to your tank, which will increase the number of hungry mouths in there, letting you add more food without your guppies being able to eat all of it. That said, finding the right feeding balance can involve a little bit of trial and error because there's a lot of different variables going on at all times. But to sum up this section, moderate consistent feeding with high quality fish food is highly recommended with a Walstad Method aquarium. Finally, we get to Hardscape, and this is one area where I do tend to deviate a little bit more away from a strict Walstad Method aquarium. That's because I personally feel that Hardscape can add secondary advantages to the tank, such as anoxic zones and things like lava rock, but it also makes a tank more visually appealing to the eye. I'm currently near the end of a fish room reorganisation, and I currently have 5 Walstad Method tanks running, with a lot more planned over the coming months. Out of those 5 tanks, 2 of them have absolutely no hardscape at all, and this approach does maximise the planting space, keeping things as easy as possible if you are new to the hobby, and I would recommend that path if it's your very first Walstad tank. However, once you do get a better sense of which plants will work well in your water parameters and their various growth rates, you can use this to manipulate the situation in your future tanks and add hardscape if you like. For example, instead of filling large portions of your tank with Bacopa caroliniana, you might be able to add a far faster grown species such as Limnophilus sessiliflora in 20% of that space and get the same results. Another example is floating plants, which you can just use in higher quantities or switch over to faster grown varieties such as water lettuce or duckweed to get a lot of toxin uptake on the surface of the tank too. In theory, this will help to reduce the need for submerged plants in the tank, letting you get some hardscape in there, but keep in mind, you can also put epiphytes such as Anubias, Java Fern, Bucephalandra or Bulbitis on the hardscape to decorate it, which will offer some advantages too. But to directly quote Dianna Walstad, she says hardscape should not overwhelm the tank and deprive plants of real estate. But personally, I do think there's ways that you can balance everything out and add some hardscape to the tank to increase the aesthetic appeal of it. So to summarise this section, hardscape does reduce the available planting space in your tank, but you can use faster grown stem, stolon or floating plants to offset that and get certain sized hardscapes in your tank if you like. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, have a good day and good luck with your Walstad Method aquariums.